Thank you. I'll hand that to you first. Yeah.
So welcome to this session, which is about the Refuge for the Destitute in Hackney. My name's Alice Block, and we're conducting it as a Q&A. Obviously, Katharine is the author of the book The Low Road, which features the Refuge for the Destitute quite a lot in the middle section. And just to kick us off, Katharine's going to give a short reading on how the main character, who's called Ann Tyrell in the book, but her real name, it's a real person, Ann Tyrell, ended up being admitted, or it's when she was admitted to the refuge.
Great, thank you. Oh, right. Mr. Haskin sat behind his desk, pen in hand, entering words in a big black leather book. Maria bobbed in front of him, and after a moment, as she looked at me, I did the same and then straightened to stand in front of him. Maria, fetch Miss Clements and Mrs. Clark. He cleared his throat. You are a new object here, and as such will receive the charity and protection of the refuge. You may wonder what an object is. You may rest assured that it means you receive charity from our institution, and that is all. There are others here in Hackney, including one for orphans, where others on the committee, argued that you should rightfully have gone, but I argued you should be admitted here, as I felt that I could reform you. There's just one last bit.
Can you put the mic near your mouth, please?
Okay, can you hear now? Okay, lovely. It must never be forgotten that we have several purposes here: to relieve the destitute, such as yourself, to reform and restore the criminal violator of the laws of God and man, and to promote the best interests of society.
Thank you. So it's quite clear from that, of course, that they had a role of reforming, but what we'd like to know really now is, can you take us back to Hannah, as she's called in the book, Ann Tyrell's life, and how you came across the story and how she ended up in the Refuge for the Destitute as an object?
So I was raised in the Waveney Valley, so that runs between Norfolk and Suffolk, the counties of Norfolk and Suffolk, and the River Waveney, you can see a part of it here runs between them, and that's quite important in the Low Road. And so I came across this story when I was visiting my parents, and it's nearly a decade ago now, so it shows how long it takes, well, certainly me, to write a book. Oh. Okay, oh.
We need a login.
Okay, let's go that way. Oh, I think it might have frozen. It's, okay, there was another picture, but the slide thing isn't working, I don't think. Yeah. But I'll tell you what's on the next slide, which is that I came across the story of a woman from my hometown called Mary Tyrell, or Tyrell, and she'd been buried on our parish boundary, so a small market town called Harleston, on the parish highway, and it was somewhere around a place called Lush Bush, which was named because another man, Harold, had also been, Harold Lush, I think, had been buried there for the same so-called crime about a decade earlier. So I'll just show you a picture of Lush Bush in a minute when we can get it. There we go, thank you. Let's see if the next one works. Yeah, so this marks the sort of spot where Mary is buried, but there's no grave. Thank you very much. There's no grave to mark where she was buried.
So Mary is the mother of Ann Tyrell, Hannah Tyrell, who's the main character in your book. You found a reference to her. What did you do then to kind of discover more, and what did you find out about them?
So this is from the Norfolk Chronicle, which was the paper at the time. And as you can see, I dug into the story of Mary Tyrell, or Tyrell, and found this story that's in the centre of the screen where it says child murder. And Mary had been accused of infanticide. The body of a baby girl, had been found in Vipon's Pond, which at that stage was in the middle of the town where I was living. It doesn't exist anymore. She'd been questioned twice, and she was about to be questioned for a third time, and then she took poison and she died. Now, at the time, if you died by suicide, that was actually still a crime. So it's 1813. It's 7 years, I think, before this was no longer deemed a crime. And so she was, as I said, buried on the parish highway. And as you can see, it says a coroner's inquest was held upon the body. The jury gave in its verdict. And then on the same evening, about 7 o'clock, she was buried on the parish highway. And there was this vast concourse of people. And that was, you know, when I go to Harleston now to visit my mum, I think that a lot of the people there, because it's a very stable population in Harleston, will be descendants of the people who witnessed this terrible thing that happened at the end of our town.
So Mary was staked through the heart for her crime, and you found some more references to this in a later account, a churchwarden's account, where somebody who'd been a young boy at the time recounted what he'd seen that awful day.
Yes, so one very young boy had witnessed this staking, and he recorded it saying, creeping between the legs of the men who stood close round the grave, he saw in the gloom of the evening the parish constable fix the stake in position while another drove it home with a heavy beetle. Mr. Oldershaw, who was both the reverend of the town and the magistrate, sitting on his horse in silent charge of the proceedings.
Thank you. So you're doing some research and you came across details of a surviving daughter who's the main character in your book, who ends up in Hackney. Can you tell us a little bit about how you traced her to the refuge and how you found her name and the records of her?
So everyone probably who's done archive research knows you're just sort of looking for a needle in a haystack, and just to change the metaphor, you also go down a lot of rabbit holes when you're doing that. So that's exactly what I did. But I had bits of information and I was trying to flesh out the rest. So I knew that there had been a surviving daughter, and she was only known as AT, so she's only known by her initials. And so sort of 200 years almost to 202 years, I think, after she had been orphaned, I started looking for her. And I guessed that her name was Anne, really just because it was quite a common name in Georgian times. So I looked for an Ann Tyrell or Tyrell. It was spelt differently in quite a lot of different documents. And I found that an Ann Tyrell had been admitted to this place, the Refuge for the Destitute in Hackney. And if you look here, it looks quite pleasant, but that's because the almshouses, like the Museum of the Home that we're in right now, are the lower ones. And then behind it, you see looming, just behind it, you see the actual refuge. This is the Male Refuge, and it was painted in about 1850 by Thomas Hosmer Shepherd. And if you wanted to sort of look it up, it's about 3 minutes walk from here, where it actually is on the Hackney Road. So it's in a block which is bounded by Hackney Road, Kramer Street running parallel to it, and then Gorsuch Place. So you can go and look at it, but I think there's nothing there but a sort of Amazon pickup location. So not much to see.
So how did you find out more about her then? I believe you used the resources at the Hackney Archives. So could you tell us a little bit more about how you went about it and what you found out about the refuge?
Okay, so at this stage I went to the Hackney Archives, and lots of you might have been to some of the talks there yesterday, and it's obviously an amazing institution, and it's a sort of bike ride from where I am in Finsbury Park, and Hackney is where my kids went to school, so it's been sort of, you know, a wonderful local archive. And I found that there was the minute books of the Refuge for the Destitute were held there, and you could look at them on microfiche, or you could actually get out the actual minute books with these huge sort of leather-bound volumes and this copper plate, I think they call it, writing. So I went to the Hackney Archives, and with the help of the staff, I started to sort of do my detective work on what happened to Anne when she actually arrived at the refuge.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the refuge, when it was set up, who was there, how it was funded?
So it was originally set up in 1804 in Lambeth, and then it moved to the Hackney Road in 1811. So just, in fact, Anne arrived in 1817, so just a few years afterwards. It was separated relatively quickly into the Male and Female Refuge. And it was really run by philanthropists. So Reverend Edward Whittaker set it up, but there were 3 quite prominent Quakers who were involved. And if you think about the spirit of the times, this is Elizabeth Fry, this sort of the Elizabeth Fry times. Grace Church Street meeting where she was close by. She visited Newgate Prison the first time in 1816. So you had this kind of zeal for reform going on, and the beginning of the flourishing of these philanthropic institutions, which was sort of the precursor, I think, to the welfare state and the care system in some ways. Yeah.
So Samuel Hall, who worked at the refuge, called it next of kin to prison, I believe. Can you tell us a little bit more about what they were trying to do there in terms of reforming the young girls and boys?
So they were trying to reform them. So the refuge was really only for girls and boys, young women, young men who were on the edge of criminality. So it was, I suppose, what you'd think now would be a sort of secure children's centre, effectively, or a young offenders institution even. But at the same time, they were always saying, we're going to reform the people here. They're going to be turned out. They're going to get respectable situations as maid servants if they were girls, and apprenticeships if they were boys. And so this is the slide of Anne's admission, which is in the minute book from April 1817. So this is exactly 4 years to the day after her mother had died by suicide and had the stake driven through the heart. And I often wonder, was it almost, it must have had so many resonances for her that she'd been sent away from her hometown like that. And it records that, I tried to make it out. I may have got some of the words wrong. A person attended from Mr. Fox. And Mr. Fox was the attorney, the lawyer in Harleston, with Ann Tyrell, who stated that the mother had destroyed herself, that the girl had then given herself to all kinds of pilfering, and the mother had then murdered one of her children and in the face of apprehension destroyed her. And here you get this flick of Anne's spirit, because it then states, the girl stated to the committee that she was now sensible that her mother had committed an iniquity and that she begged to be admitted. The girl is illegitimate, admitted. And you just wonder, well, if she was now sensible, did it mean that she had been quite resistant to blaming her mother beforehand, but then she became an object? And for people like Hannah in the book, it was quite a tedious place to live, but it was at least safe and there was food.
Okay. So there was one male refuge and one female refuge. And one of the things that you found out, I believe, from the reports of the refuge was that the work they did and the food was all very repetitive. Can you tell us a little bit more about the sort of key philanthropists that were involved and how they thought that keeping them busy might be a way to reform them, and what they were busy doing?
We'll come on to that later. So, as I said, it was formed by Edward Whittaker, but they had this great kind of project to involve dignitaries. So they had 2 Royal Highnesses involved at this time. The Dukes of York and Kent means nothing to me. The Bishop of London was involved. As I said, Quakers were also involved, and they were kept very busy. There's one of the 3, I think, short reports about the refuge. So I think these would have been like annual reports, but these were every 4 years. And in the one from 1815, which you can actually read on Google Books if you want to have a look at it, it says the utmost attention is paid to the improvement of morals and suitable admonition and religious instruction. So I think there were a lot of prayers. And the girls were put into the laundry, and obviously Nick Hyam, I don't know if he's still here, talked a bit about the importance of laundry then. And the trustees and patrons often sent their washing into the laundry at the refuge, thinking that that was a good thing to do. But they did also complain that it often came out just as dirty as they'd sent it in, or that things weren't mended. So I think the girls had quite a lot of fun, and the males, the men, the boys were sent to gardening, working with wood and other manual labour, and they were trained up for apprenticeships. Some of them went into military service, some of them went into tailoring, shoemaking, carpentry, and I definitely would have wanted to be a boy. I know that my family knows how obsessed I am with wood. So There was lots of washing for the girls in the laundry, starching. Mangles, I think, weren't really rolled out and available until the late 1800s rather, so they wouldn't have had that. But there is a picture of the refuge where you can see a mangle much, much later, which was in the Hackney Gazette a few years ago. So the girls look quite doleful in it, but at least they're not having to wring out these really heavy sheets by hand.
Right. So the girls were being trained up for service, domestic service, I believe. One of the things that you found out in your book was about the food, or you write about in the book. And reading the book, I found it really engaging to hear about what they ate. So will you indulge me for a second while I tell you what was on the menu? Because I thought, for me, that was actually really fascinating. So this is what they actually ate. So it was beef on Sundays. They had, with the beef, they had greens and potatoes. They had broth on Mondays, broth on Tuesdays, suet pudding on Wednesdays. Thursdays it was pea soup, Friday fish, and milk puddings and cheese on Saturdays. And apparently they just went on rotation with the food. A little bit like the laundry apparently also went on rotation. Is that right?
Yes, I think it was a bit dull, but at least it was relatively good food. And at the time when Anne would have been in rural East Anglia, so that's the sort of fallout of the Napoleonic Wars, and in fact it was quite, there was a lot of destitution at the time, so she probably would have arrived quite thin and then filled out because she was being sort of looked after at this stage for the first time in her life.
And you also mentioned about the laundry, and there's also a short extract in the book which describes the laundry that they did.
My first laundry day, the coppers had been filled already and were steaming with warm water. Mrs. Clark presided over the objects and their work. She told me I'd work here every day except Saturday, when there was a half day, and Sunday, our rest day, when they had to go to church. We take the soiled washing in on the Monday. It comes from our patrons and other well-wishers who pay their subscription to keep you all here, so you must wash with great care. Maria, you will work with Hannah, separate the materials one from another and then wash the colours, she said. We set to work sorting out white linen from muslin, coloured cottons from white cottons, linens from woolens, greasy clothes straight into a tub of lime and water. Careful now, it can sting, Mrs. Clark said hurriedly as she was called away. As soon as she was gone, Maria grabbed a long wooden paddle, climbed up to the copper and banged on it, so the whole room was ringing with sound. Another girl joined in.
Thank you. So one of the things which is important to the book, and is a theme running through the book, is the relationship between two of the main characters. And you first found that relationships, like their relationship, in your research on the refuge. So could you tell us a little bit more about the relationships between the objects?
So there's a couple of PhDs that have been done on the refuge, and they're really worth reading, and I recommend the work of Peter King, who was a professor at Leicester, and he was the sort of academic who first found out about the same-sex relationships. And I think we might have the same problem again, but Hannah Ann met another destitute at the refuge, and she spent several years as a sort of Thelma and Louise relationship between them, racketing through London. So there were other academics who wrote about the punishments for the girl objects. Right, okay, I can't get on to the next one at the moment. But there was talk about unnatural behaviour, about that took place in the hammocks where they slept, and they had to be quite careful not to set all the hammocks swinging if obviously they were hopping in and out. It wasn't really bed hopping, I'm sure it was a lot more difficult. And it was more than frowned on. And one girl object who then worked in prostitution or sex work, she actually said that she was kind of rendered depraved in the refuge. And of course, this is very embarrassing for all those reverends and Quakers. Boys were put in cells called black holes for bad behaviour. And girls were locked up in the lobby of the Female Refuge. And one girl was so infuriated that she was locked up that she actually broke the door down. So sometimes they were put into hard-ish labour and deprived of food. But in the Low Road, these two girls become friends before the relationship deepens. And this is just a short extract which you can read, but talking about how long she's known Annie, who she meets in the refuge and she knows later. And she obviously has very strong feelings towards her, and that is the sort of narrative that sustains the book and is very much based on academic research here and in Australia, where the girls are eventually transported to.
So the girls meet at the refuge and they form a loving relationship, but there's bumps in the road for them and they're back and forth. Can you tell us some of the bumps in the road for them and what happens to them? Not obviously no spoilers.
Well, the girls were supposed to be put in domestic service. So every 2 years, after about 2 years in the refuge, they were normally trained up to be maid servants. And this happened to our girl, Hannah Ann, and she was sent into service in nearby Gracechurch Street to Mr. and Mrs. Harding, who I think were involved with the refuge. So quite often they were sent into service to people who sort of knew them or who they'd be recommended to. And it didn't go very well for her. She was actually dismissed after 6 weeks, so she obviously was not a great maidservant. And she was sent back, and Joseph Hoskin, in another minute entry that I found, said that she had been dismissed for being idle, impertinent and dishonest. And so she had spirit. And I think her conduct was described as untoward, which I believe is another derogatory word. But I suspect she wanted to get back to the refuge, and that's something you see mirrored in the Australian work factories, where a lot of girls and women were transported to, where they would commit crimes to get back to the work factories, not because they were very nice to be in, but because they had friendships and possibly romantic relationships to return to.
Thank you. So you traced Hannah, as she's called in the book, and her real name's Ann Tyrell, and Annie Simpkins, and is that her real name, Annie Simpkins? As they're called in the Low Road. And like other objects, they got caught up in the criminal justice system, which in Georgian times was quite serious and the punishments were very harsh. Can you tell us a little bit about how they ended up on trial at the Old Bailey?
So I always thought this was very nicely kind of paradoxical, or maybe ironic, in that they decided to abscond one winter night in December 1821, which is interesting in itself, because if you're going to escape and run away, you'd probably choose nicer weather than a winter. So I suspect one of them was about to be sent into service and they didn't want to be parted. So they absconded with all of this. They basically stole all the laundry that they could. So it's like they took a kind of revenge, but they didn't get very far. So as I said, the refuge was on the Hackney Road. So all of you know your London geography. So they walked south, they walked over the river, and they walked down to a place called in Southwark called, I think, St George's Fields. And there were some philanthropic institutions there, and I think Bedlam was there for a while, but at the time it was also known as quite a low area, so lots of thieving, lots of tenements where you'd have one family sleeping during the day and another during the night, which was something that happened at that time. And Joseph Hoskin found out about it, and he set off in hot pursuit on this winter's night, and he apprehended them with all this laundry. And at this point, he could have decided, okay, that's really naughty, but we'll let you back, into the refuge. They were quite forgiving, but I think he was at his end of his tether with these two. So instead, he put them in charge of a watchman, and then he sent them to the Old Bailey.
Okay. And you found actually the records of their trial at the Old Bailey, which is fascinating as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Old Bailey records and what's available, and then what you found out about their actual real trial?
For anyone who hasn't sort of delved into the Old Bailey online proceedings, I do recommend it. You can search by, everything, murder, dates, anything you want. And it's a really interesting record of all the crimes that have been tried at the Old Bailey. So I recommend it. And I found the Old Bailey proceedings for the second day of the January Assizes in 1822. And these were held in the Old Bailey, and they would have been held in Newgate Prison before that, and then taken along this underground corridor that then linked the Newgate Prison with the Old Bailey, and arrived in there on the morning of January the 10th, 1822. And because they had stolen so many goods, they were tried with a crime called grand larceny, and that carried much more serious sentences than the petty crimes that they could have been tried with. So as you can see there, they did something else that was a bit bad. You can see that they also took clothing belonging to the trustees. So that was like a really tactical error, I think, because that meant that the committee had to kind of prosecute them. And in fact, the Old Bailey had written to the committee, I found in another entry in the Hackney Archives, and said, well, do you want to have these girls back? And they were like, no, not really. So they actually got them prosecuted at this point.
Okay. And you found the actual record of the court case. Do you have a short reading from the actual transcript? Or? Yeah.
So this is taken from the actual transcript that you can find in the Old Bailey, and this is actually the verbatim account of what he found. And as you can see, he put them in charge with the watchman. He took a bundle from Tyrrell and a bag from Simpkins containing the property belonging to the institution, and at this time they both blamed each other. And they had, as I said, an awful lot of linen, and they also had belongings belonging to the bookkeeper and Clements, who gave evidence, and then Eleanor Clark, the housekeeper, gave evidence. And so they really, they didn't really stand a chance at this point. And Annie and Hannah had sort of fallen out and didn't support each other. And then the jury deliberated and decided that they were guilty. And the Judge Newman Knowles, he actually at that point sentenced them and others to transportation. So that was a huge sentence. Even in the 1800s, obviously transportation had been going on from the late 1700s, but even at this time, that was a kind of body blow to anybody. They knew what it meant. So they were sentenced to be transported for 7 years. And at this point, and this is one thing that I think about Ann Tyrell, is that she was only 15 when this happened. She was really young. And Annie Simpkins was 18. She was the oldest person who'd been sentenced to be transported that day. But if you think about everything that she'd endured in her short life, it is incredible. And you'd hope that she would have a little bit more mercy these days. And on that same day, he had other people whipped and jailed, but they were transported or sentenced to it.
So then they go off to the prison hulks or Newgate. Tell us where they went.
So they carried on their slide through criminal justice, the criminal justice system at this point. So at this point, there's quite a hold-up with transportation. There's quite a lot of people being sentenced to being transported. So in fact, they go to Millbank Prison, and Millbank Prison is underneath Tate Britain. So it's right by the Thames, and it's a huge prison. Originally, the original design was by Jeremy Bentham, the great social reformer. His design was described as too costly, and a similar design was eventually commissioned, and it was this sort of pentagon shape. And if you go around the sort of environs, the surroundings of Tate Britain, you can see bits of the penitentiary wall, and you can see the trenches that were dug to stop the prisoners escaping around the Pentagon, and you can see some people have got their washing lines in there, there's raised beds in there, and it's nice to see that they've been humanised from their original function. But at the same time, they go there, and then what happens? So let's talk a bit about what happens next.
Okay, so you thought at this point, I believe, that they were going to disappear from the history of the refuge for the Destitute, but how did you find additional minutes of them being there, and what did you find?
I mean, I literally got the minute books for the years and just looked through every single page looking for their names. And I think you can see how faint their names are at this point. I read a letter from Ann Tyrell and Ann Simpkins, and they're requesting money while they're in prison. So this is while they're still in Newgate before the trial. And even though the committee had decided that they don't want these girls back, they did actually send them some money, which would have really helped them at that time. So they keep on having this kind of these little flicks of contact with the refuge, but they then go, as I said, they go to Millbank Prison, but they have a pretty terrible time there because they arrive at a time when there's outbreaks of this disease condition called marsh fever, which wasn't cholera but was a pretty horrible condition, and it was so bad that by 1824 the prison was closed and cleaned, and the remaining prisoners were cleared out, and some went to an infirmary up in Regent's Park, the ophthalmic I think it was called, and others I found went somewhere else, and that included our girls. And at this point I went to the National Archives at Kew, and I found a document done up with red ribbon, and I unfolded it, and I found that the girls had actually been sent to prison hulks in the Thames up by Woolwich, so up the sort of area where Charles Dickens had talked about in Great Expectations. And they were some of the only women who had ever gone to a prison hulk. So there was Ann Simpkins and Ann Tyrell. They were on two ships, the Heroine and the Narcissus. But this document was the document of their pardon by Sir Robert Peel. So in 1825, the girls were actually set free. They were never going to be transported at this point, and they ended up at the Ship Inn in Millbank, which is right next to the penitentiary. Did either of them ever end up coming back to the refuge after that? This is just the prison wall, actually, at the penitentiary, just to show you, if you ever want to go and touch it, feel a bit of history, that's where it is. But this is what happened to Ann Tyrell next. So she has this chance at this point. She could be, she could work in a pub. I mean, we've all enjoyed it. But instead, Anne just didn't stick with that. So at this point, this is the last entry I found in the Refuge for the Destitute, the Hackney Archives with the minute books from the Refuge for the Destitute. And Anne had obviously ended up on the streets working as in prostitution, and had applied to the Guardian Society. I think it's called the Guardian Society for the Preservation of Public Morals. So they took what they called, I think, penitent prostitutes and tried to reform them. But then they found out that she'd been a criminal, and at this point they kicked her out because they didn't ever take criminals. They kicked her out, and she somehow ended up back in Harston, my hometown, and she then went back to the Refuge for the Destitute, claiming that everyone she knew in Harston was dead. I don't know if that was true. Certainly Henry Fox was still alive, the lawyer, but he might not have wanted to see her. And they take her back in. So this is the last time I found her in those records, and she's sent to the temporary refuge, which is much harder than the permanent refuge, and I think they grounded oyster shells. They did really hard work there, and that is the last time she appears in those records, except for one last one which is not there but relates to the refuge. Yes, so the last record is in the Harston Parish Records, so back in my hometown, and Joseph Hoskin, the superintendent of the refuge, wrote to Henry Fox, and he said that AT had been prevented by the laws of her country from producing the fruits of gratitude, and what this meant is that she actually had been sent to Botany Bay.
Okay. So that was your last trace of her in the records. What did you do then? You had all this information. How did you make the choice about what to do with it all?
So at this point, I can't find her anymore, and I'm, by trade, I'm an investigative journalist, and I've written lots of non-fiction. but I had to sort of make a bit of a leap and decide I had to novelise the story if I wanted to tell the Australian story. And if you look here, this is outside Tate Britain actually. This is a stone buttress that was erected, I think, by the London County Council. And it says, near this site stood Millbank Prison, which was opened in 1816 and closed in 1880. And this buttress stood at the head of the river steps from which, until 1867, prisoners sentenced to transportation embarked on their journey to Australia. So, there are these there's a few marks there in the UK, very few. I think this is the only one that I've ever found in London. So I decided to novelise the story of Anne, or Hannah and Annie, and base it on a mosaic of the 26,000 women who were transported. And that was out of the 162,000 convicts altogether who were transported. And they were transported between 1767 and 1868. And they went, and some of them made new lives in Australia, but at the same time, of course, they were coming into land that belonged to Indigenous people. And so there was a complete sort of desecration of the country at the same time.
Would there have been parallels for the girls going to Australia with their experiences in the refuge for the destitute? So as convicts, was there something that was similar, being in institutions, for example?
Okay, so this is me in Australia, so I went to research it. And in Australia, as you can probably see, people are very proud of what used to be called the convict stain. And yet here in the UK, I think the Migration Museum has estimated 1 in 18 of us have convict ancestry, but we don't really know about it, which is extraordinary. But that ancestry included lots of women, some men, going into work factories all over Australia and in what was then called Van Diemen's Land, so Tasmania. And those work factories were very similar. And of course, what do you think the primary occupation of the women was? It was laundry. So yeah, there's always this thing going back to the washing. So they would have ended up in the same situation. But again, you have this kind of same-sex strand as well appearing, which is that the female work factories were called things like, dens of vice. There was unnatural behaviour, which was just women either falling in love with or having relationships with other women, some of which were predatory, but many of which were very loving. And so it was really interesting to see that strain carried on all the way through. Of course, for men who fell in love with other men, it was a much more serious thing, and I think was punished in Australia by death. I mean, Kirsty, who's an academic, might know better than me, but I believe that would be the case then. So there were these parallels, but there was also a kind of much more of a freedom for the women as well. So I think some of the women would have got assigned to landscapes like this in the Hunter Valley in north of Sydney, which for me, when I went there, was very similar to the Waveney Valley. It had that same beautiful, a much more intense golden light, but the same sort of shape of trees and the same kind of rural landscape. So there were lots of parallels for me in going back, as well as charting these two girls who hopefully would have had a better life in Australia than they had in Norfolk, Hackney, and then sort of criminal London, the criminal justice system.
Okay, so let's go back to the refuge for the destitute. Can you tell us a little bit more about its history, what happened to it, and how many people went through it, those kind of questions?
So it kind of staggered on. It always had quite precarious financing, and it makes you wonder, because they would produce these reports saying how many virtuous people they'd survived and put into service, but then there were stories like Hannah and Annie pitching up at the Old Bailey, but thousands of young people would have gone through their doors. They carried on until 1849, and then the male refuge closed, but a female refuge did survive, and it moved to Dalston, and I'm not entirely sure where. And then in 1922, I believe, it merged with the Elizabeth Fry Refuge. And the Elizabeth Fry charity still lives on today and still works with young women coming out of prison. So you can see that work still continues in some form, which is fantastic. It's the last vestiges of the refuge, I think, are still there.
So I believe for you, the Low Road was really trying to look at lost histories, sort of hidden histories of young girls and women that may or may not have been literate at the time, whose stories weren't recorded. Can you tell us a little bit about why you wanted to do that and why you think it's important to uncover those lost histories?
I mean, the history of the English working classes, as E.P. Thompson always talked about, was, for him, it was the story of the people who stayed here. And if you, rereading it, as I did recently, I realised that transportation was never mentioned, which was really interesting for me, because these were also, you know, the English working classes, but they ended up being exiled, often for the crime of really being poor. And for me, those forgotten voices are really important. The swing rioters in East Anglia, the sort of agricultural machine breakers, again, their story is very rarely told, even in East Anglia, where they were sort of this major force, and the West Country as well. So I think, you know, compared to, say, the Chartists, we've forgotten a little bit about these more agricultural agricultural workers who rose up. And then there's this narrative of girls and women who loved other girls and women, and that's a really important narrative to recuperate, not to sort of apply if it's not there, but to find it in the PhD theses and in reports of the time and realise it's there and to draw it out, I think is kind of important work for amateur historians like myself. There's this phrase that Hilary Mantel, the novelist, used, which was to make a virtue of the constraint of the facts, and I think that's a very useful thing to do, even if you're novelising things, is to find the real facts and use them as your skeleton for the story you're telling. And I hope I've done that in The Low Road.
So how closely does your book stick to fact and how much is it fictionalised?
I mean, as much as possible, I've tried to use the cadences that I grew up hearing in East Anglia, and then going to Australia, as I was lucky enough to do, really helped with meeting local historians and talking to academics about the work that they'd done. So and then, of course, the archival work is absolutely key as well. So poring over those minute books, looking at microfiches, undoing original documents, I mean, that's all part of the thrill. And, you know, I love to do it again, but I think it is important to try and stick to the facts if you can. But then you kind of use it as a jumping off point for anything that you novelise, of course.
Thank you. And one final thing, I believe that you also uncovered evidence of black Georgians and also Indian heritage, South Asian objects at the refuge, is that correct?
So there was definitely evidence of, I think, formerly enslaved young, certainly at least one young man who is obviously a black Georgian who was at the refuge, and possibly others. But I think the Hackney History, the women who are working on the Hackney History at the time, because I launched The Low Road at the Hackney Archives and met some of the women who were involved in the sort of work on Hackney women, said that there was quite a lot of work going on with women who were then called ayahs, so women who had been brought over from India and then sometimes sort of just abandoned on the streets after their purpose had been served. And I think recuperating all those stories is really important, but that's not something I've personally found in the refuge minutes as such.
And I have one final question before we open it up to the floor, which is, what did it feel like to open up some of those minute books and other documents, maybe at Kew, that looked like they'd never been opened before, and find information about your two protagonists?
I mean, it's a complete thrill just to see the signature of someone like Robert Peel setting these girls free, and you know, and to find out where they'd been, and there is this kind of feeling of how do you walk back in time 200 years, because it's pre-photographs, isn't it? So I spent a lot of time in galleries as well, looking at paintings, and you're always trying to find the London below the London, and looking at old maps is wonderful. There's the Layers of London maps, which some of you will know, where you can kind of go right back in time. So trying to always find those original sources is just great. I love it.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Katharine. So let's open up for questions. We've got a microphone, so do we have a volunteer, Joseph, to write the microphone?
In the introductory leaflet we were sent about the programme, it refers to the refuge being in Hackney Road. does anything exist? Is any memorial being put up in the Hackney Road about that place?
We don't have a mic now.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, yeah, it's not. Sorry. So I couldn't find any vestige of it. So that was very frustrating, because it would be nice if there were some kind of plaques of these places, wouldn't it? I'd really like that. But yeah, as I said, there was an Amazon pickup point and a couple of other things. And it also shows how quickly London changes, because when I cycled there 5 years ago, it was a car park. So that shows, doesn't it, how fast that kind of London, the silting up of layers of London happens, doesn't it? Oh, should we just keep the...
Yeah, we might. You just might
If
have to
you
talk
say it,
about
and then I'll repeat the question back.
How often were there cases like Anne and Annie not actually being reformed by these places and becoming criminals? Did that happen often, and did you look into other women who had similar experiences?
So the question was, like, how often did you have these cases of the naughty girls, so to speak, as opposed to these virtuous servants who went on to a life of, you know, being a maidservant, and if they were good, no, probably being a scullery maid and then maybe becoming, you know, a lady's maid or something a little bit more superior. And the question is we don't really know, because I'd have to do a statistical analysis, but a good number of them did do things like abscond from the refuge. That's why they barred the windows, actually. They would do things like cut off the buttons that were quite distinctive of the refuge and then try and sell clothing. Some of them had families, so they would just run off. So they weren't really orphans. They were supposed to be perfectly destitute and really not have any family. But often people would put them into the refuge because they could get food there, and it was a way of feeding the family. And there were other people involved in criminal activity. So they stressed the good cases and tried to smooth over the bad, I think.
I may have missed this, but how did Anne get from Waveney to Hackney? How did that happen?
So the question is how Ann Tyrell ended up at the refuge for the destitute. And I don't know the exact reason. What I do know is that she spent 4 years in Harleston. She then was accused of pilfering. And I love this because around the same age that Anne was, I actually was found shoplifting stickers and sweets. So I kind of feel like there's identification there. So I wasn't sent away from Harleston, but in her case, the Harleston townsfolk took up a collection to send her to the refuge. So they must have just thought, we want rid of this girl, or maybe there was a kind of collective silence about what had happened to her mother and they wanted to get rid of the last trace of her. There was clearly some correspondence between Henry Fox, the attorney in Harleston, and the superintendent of the refuge, so perhaps they knew each other.
Hi. I think you touched on it briefly, but you were talking about how it was quite tricky to find evidence of these queer relationships. And I was wondering what you did find and what that evidence looked like in this case.
So the question was just how did I find evidence of these relationships between women and, well, girls and girls, or women and women, because they were quite young when this happened. And in fact, I changed the age of the younger girl to 16 in the low road just because my editor said that would be better if it was legal. So, but it was actually really in PhD theses that I found that there was quite a lot of evidence of hammock hopping, and it was there in the literature, so it meant I could kind of use that as a jumping off point. But for me, most of it was around this sort of surmise that these young women stuck together through thick and thin. So they met in sort of around 1817, 1818, and they didn't then separate, as far as we know, until 1825. So that does show it's either a very strong friendship or it's something deeper than that. So I felt there was enough evidence that I could use as a jumping off point to have that in the novel.
It strikes me there must have been thousands of destitute young women or children in Georgian times. So was the Institute completely oversubscribed? I mean, how did they choose who they took on?
So the question was, obviously there were thousands of people who were destitute, young women, young men at that time, so how did the refuge sort of filter them? And they did filter them very quite brutally, really. So they had to have some evidence of criminal activity. So that was the kind of the first filter, and they had to show that there was some will to reform. So I think that's why you see in that first minute entry that Ann Tyrell says, I am now she's now sensible that her mother had committed an iniquity. So you had to sort of have this sort of penitence. And they did not admit people. So in the minute book entries, if you ever get the chance to go and look at them in the archives, after the committee meetings, which were every Saturday, I think, at 1 p.m, they said admitted or not admitted. So quite a lot of people weren't admitted. And if they were found out to have family, and so the family could support them and there was no evidence of criminal activity, they might be suggested that they go to an orphanage. So there was an orphanage nearby in Hackney or something else like that, but they wouldn't necessarily have been admitted.
Okay, I think we've actually run out of time, is that right?
Unfortunately, yes. But if people want to carry on the conversation, then please do go through to the garden and carry on there.